If you could have a one-on-one chat with a fly fishing expert, how much do you think that would help improve your abilities as an angler? Now, imagine that you'd had that conversation with over 600 fly fishing experts. Your skills would grow exponentially, wouldn't they? Well, Dave Stewart of the Wet Fly Swing podcast has done exactly that. He has interviewed over 600 experts on his show over the years, and today, Dave is joining us here at Untangled to reveal the 5 most important lessons he's learned from the best thinkers and leaders in the industry. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant, joined this week by none other than Dave Stewart of the Wet Fly Swing podcast and website. Dave, how you doing, man?
Good, Spencer. Thanks for having me on here.
You bet. I'm stoked to have you on and get to hear some of your wisdom. So I love to hear what other folks have to say, because I think folks get tired of listening to me yammer on all the time. So
right.
There's only so many Diet Coke and wing jokes that you can make before it gets stale, I think.
Yep. That's right. No, I'm here. I'll be your sidekick on the comedy journey tonight. We'll see. I'll see how I can do.
Awesome, man. I appreciate it. So you've been doing the Wet Fly Swing podcast and the website for how long now?
Man, it's been, so we launched the website in 2015, and then 2017, end of 2017, we launched the podcast. That was kind of I set a goal, and I did it, and I launched it. And yeah, so it's been, how many years has it been? Like, we're going 7 years, 6, 7 years.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. That's fantastic. So, yeah. And that's the name of the game, though. You just got to keep it up.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we started, I think we started as one episode a week. Yeah. I'm going to make sure I do that. I'm not going to miss a week. And we haven't missed a week in all that time. Oh, wow. And now we've amped it up a little bit. And now we've started doing 2 episodes a week a few years ago. And now this year, every week, we've done 3 full-length episodes a week, interviews.
Man. So that's how you got to over 600 interviews, right? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, now if you think about it, 3 a week, do the numbers, we're doing basically, I think, is that 100 per year or something like
150, that? I think, but I'm not a math teacher.
Yeah. See, that's the problem. I'm not good at math. So we're doing 150 a year. So if we keep this up, we're going to be pumped. We're going to hit 1,000 in, not too long, right? I'm not that good at math as well, but in a few years we'll hit 1,000.
Man, that's spectacular. Tip my hat to you, man. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
good
thanks.
work. You bet. Well, and with those 600 interviews that you've done, you've interviewed all sorts of experts, passionate fly anglers, and you've learned a ton over the years doing that, because I'm sure you experience this. You sit down, you do the show with somebody, and oftentimes it feels like you end up learning a lot more from it than maybe the person that you were with, or maybe even the viewers. It's nice because it helps enrich your understanding of the sport a little bit more, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's what's been fun about it, because all these places that we're, all these people and places we're going to on virtually, I'm not, none of us can hit all these places, but at least I can learn about it and share it with other people and our listeners. Yeah. And then I'm thinking like, okay, yeah, this is a place I want to get to eventually. And so now we're slowly getting around the country and hitting some of those places, like the Driftless. I've never been to the Driftless. I've heard about it many times on the podcast. And finally this year I'm going to hit the Driftless. So I'm pretty excited.
Really? Which part of it are you going to?
So we're going out with the Driftless Angler with Jerry, and we got Jason Randall's going to be there helping out, doing the whole program. So I'm not exactly sure. I know we're going with Jerry. They're going to take us again. Number one for me is get a guide. That's number one thing. So it's like I'm a good fisherman. I think I'm a pretty good fisherman, but I've always found that I've had struggles like everybody. And one of the So, and we'll talk a little more about that, I think, as we go.
Yeah, well, nothing beats that local knowledge. And that's a great segue, though, because of those 600 interviews you've done, you've got 5 tips that you're going to share today with the audience here at Untangled that will hopefully help our audience. We're mostly beginners here. I mean, we've got a lot of, I don't know if a lot's the right word. We've got a good core group of some intermediate and even some expert anglers who listen too, but we really take pride in breaking things down for the beginner. And so out of those 600 interviews you've done, you've put together the top 5 tips that you've learned that you think are going to help the beginners out.
Yeah.
And
I,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, yeah, and that's 100% true. I mean, I basically, with all these tips, and we do a lot of tips and tricks, most of our episodes, I really try to focus it on some topic. So I
Hmm.
try to get, these tips. But, these are things that I've heard over and over and over again from some, the best, and everything in between. People that say, like, these are the things that I wish I would have done. These are things that somebody knew. Like, I have a question now I've been asking, like, go back to your beginner self, your beginner fly fish yourself, and what advice would you give that person, right? And these are the tips that they would, that's what keeps coming up.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting? Like you talk to these folks, the titans of the sport, and really a lot of their advice is usually very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I've
Yeah.
found really interesting. Now the way they convey it is completely different, right? The way Kelly Gallup teaches is completely different than how Tom Rosenbauer teaches.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's still the same when you break it down. I've always found that really fascinating. Like
Yeah.
there are some wonderfully insightful things you can learn, but at the end of the day, when you get down to it and you just make it simple, fly fishing really isn't that hard, and it really just boils down to some simple concepts
Yeah.
at the end of the day.
That's it. That's
But
it.
well, what's your first tip for us, man?
Yeah, so I mean, we've already kind of gave it away. I mean, that's it. It's
Yeah.
get a guide. I mean, there's a lot to this, but really it's like, I mean, the learning curve, if you want to kind of flatten that learning curve, getting a guide is going to be huge, right? Because you can imagine, especially, and again, some people getting started, they might not have a ton of money, so that's fine. I'm not saying you have to go out there right away, spend $500 on a guide, but, get out there, jump in the water, flail around, get used to it, but get some help. I mean, that's the bottom line. If you do this all on your own, I mean, I have an example with myself. I learned to spey cast basically by watching Simon Gosworth videos, the Rio video back in the day. And I literally took that video, watched it over and over, went on the water, practiced, watched it over and over for a month before I went on this big trip up to Canada. And, I learned to spey cast, but to this day, I'm still struggling to break some habits that I have because I didn't have an instructor. Right. And so I think that's the sort of take home message that, you can learn. It's just going to take you a lot longer, and it's okay. We want to fail and all that stuff, but getting a guide, once you get into it, is going to basically help you tremendously because, obviously they're going to show you some spots that are going to likely get you into fish. That's another thing we've heard of. Like, when you're new, especially if you're brand new, that's the one thing that people can leave if they're not catching any fish, right? If you go for a year or two and fly fishing and you don't catch a single fish, people might not stick around. So I think that's the thing. We got to get these new folks that are in it catching fish, and a guide is likely going to help you do that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree 100%. And I want to follow up on that spay thing real quick before I follow up on anything else. I've been teaching myself how to spay cast as
Yeah.
well. And oh my goodness, I wish I had a guide. But
Mm-hmm.
there's not a lot of spay casters in Wyoming.
Right.
Imagine that, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, did you catch fish when you went up on your Canadian trip?
Yeah, that's the amazing thing. I mean, I have a great story. So we went up there. I was the only one of my three buddies that got the spey rod.
Mm-hmm.
We ended up in places where we were literally, there was like vertical walls behind us and you couldn't back cast. In some of those places you had to make a long cast, and because I had that spey rod, 100% I caught some massive steelhead I still haven't caught fish bigger than that. And I know 100% because I had the spey rod, right? That was the reason.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's just one of those things where it's another tool in the toolbox,
Yep.
and like anything, the more, like even with my business and anything else, I'm paying people because I know that that's how you get better. If you want to get better, one step better, you should be paying for the people that have already been where you've been, and they will help you get there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting concept because I'm mostly self-taught. My grandpa, my dad both fly fished,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of the instruction I got from my dad was, "Here's this rod. Here's some flies. Don't get it tangled. Meet me back at the truck."
Right.
and
Yeah.
and so a lot of it was I ended up being pretty much a self-taught angler. So I do think there's a lot of value in paying for that stuff too. But I guess from your point of view, do you think is it possible to become a really good angler without um without paying for that guide?
Yes. 100%. Yeah. And I think there's validity in not paying at all. Yeah, do your thing, and maybe you'll even be a better angler. Who knows, right? Because you're learning on your way, and that's part of some of the other stuff I'm going to talk about is that there's some other things you can do even if you don't pay for a guide.
Yeah.
But for me, I mean, in my example, I have an interesting example because my dad had a local fly shop. I grew up in a shop. My dad was the world. I learned everything, and almost to my detriment because I didn't expand out and learn from other people because my dad. And so one of those things was the spay. It's a funny thing now, right? So my dad was 100% against spay fishing when I was a kid. He was like, over my dead body will I be casting a spay rod, sort of thing.
Why do you feel that way? Do you know?
Because he grew up, he was one of the old school guys who basically pioneered fly fishing for steelhead on the Deschutes back in the day, and it was all single handed rod, right? So he got in, he was in there in the late 50s, early 60s before spay was there, and it was just his thing, right? He loved it, and then the spay thing came. It was almost like some people joke about whatever new topic is in fly fishing, Euro nymphing, tenkara.
Yeah.
He was the same way. He's like, you know what? I'm not doing that new thing. I'm going to stick with my spay. And he's just an old guy, and he did it. But for me, I followed my dad. I was like, all right, I'm not doing spay either. But now when I look back at, man, I wish in the late 90s I would have started casting a spay rod, because right now I'd probably be I'd be a lot better. I'm sure.
Oh, definitely. So circling back to the guide thing, and I should say in full disclosure too, I'm self-taught, but I did spend a lot of time with a friend of mine who's a really, really accomplished guide. His name's Ryan Kelly. He doesn't guide anymore, but he's out on the Green River. And I always joke around that Ryan gave me my PhD in fishing streamers, because he really did. I mean, he taught me more in a couple of years in his boat than I've learned than I could have ever learned on my own. And granted, I was lucky. I got to spend, in my early 20s, I was spending close to 300 days a year on the water.
Wow. Holy cow.
I got to learn a lot of just trial and error. Is really the school of hard knocks is where I learned a lot of my stuff from. So well, I realize a lot of folks don't have that opportunity either. So a guide is a good way to shorten that learning curve.
That's a good point. I was just thinking, so sure, we're talking about a guide, but yeah, I mean, if you have a friend, if there's a local group, anything to help you get a little bit of help out there, right? That's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So if we want to get a guide and we want to make sure we're getting our money's worth, because that's an investment, and I'll say right now, guides are worth their money.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, I think a lot of folks see the price and they don't realize that half that price, almost always half, sometimes a little bit more, is going to the outfitter. So the guide doesn't pocket the $700 in the day. The guide's seeing maybe 250, 300 of that, plus whatever you tip them.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, that's still good, but it's seasonal and they've got to pay their own taxes. They don't have health insurance, so it adds up. Yeah. It adds up. But you're still going to go drop that. I mean, a drift boat float right now, it's about $700 in my neck of the woods.
Yeah.
So how do you pick a good guide? Do you have any tips for helping folks out if they want to go that route?
That is a good question. To be honest with you, I mean, I've been with the podcasts. For me, it's been a little weird. Like, I always think of be that person that you're one step of the person below you to help them. But I'm a little in a weird place because I've interviewed all these people. So I've looked at who have resonated most with me and our listeners, and who have I held back. That's why we start out with Jeff Liskay, Steelhead in the Great Lakes, right? I just knew he was the guy. And he's your ultimate guide. I will say there's some, there are some services out there. To answer your question, I don't have a great answer. I think you probably have a better answer than me, because I know episode 61 of your podcast, you talked a little about kind of on this topic, right? The guides, choosing a guide and stuff like that.
Yeah, a little bit.
But I mean, there are some services out there that are growing. The guidebook is a new service. There's some people that are helping to, get past over that hump. I mean, I think the biggest thing you can do 100% is to just call the person, talk to them, talk to them, look on social media, make sure they got, some reviews, stuff like that. Just make sure this isn't like a brand new person and again, I understand the brand new guys and stuff, but you want somebody who's got the experience. You can't just jump, just like anything, you're not going to buy a car without doing a little due diligence, and same thing with a guide. So I think, and you'll know who you resonate with when you talk to that person, you can just tell. So I feel like that conversation is a big part of it.
Oh, 100%. And then being upfront with the guide on what you expect out of the day, because guides, and I'll be careful making this generalization, but a lot of times they default to, well, you paid me, you want to just catch as many fish as possible.
Right.
And maybe that's not what you want to do. Maybe you want to go out with that guide and spend all day getting your dry fly drifts just dialed, or you want to work on your Euro nymphing, right? You got to communicate that up front to the guide so that they can help you out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Awesome. Well, what is tip number 2, my friend?
So tip number 2 is, and this is one we've heard just as much as getting a guide or help, is observe, be observant. And this is something that, again, a lot of us I've struggled with, because you want to fish. You just want to get on the water and jump in there and fish. But, I think the biggest tip is stepping back and just taking a moment and seeing what's going on, right? So if you're trout fishing, this is the thing. You get out of your car, you're walking to the river, you're looking what's going on. Are there any bugs hatching? Are there spider webs, right? And there's a lot of just figuring out kind of what's happening. And then you get to the water, sit back, take your time. Don't just cast a fly right out in the water. See what's happening. Maybe there's a fish popping its head out, because there might be a fish right off the bank, right in front of you, that you spook if you don't give it time. So observe, and that goes with a lot of different things, but basically being observant, right? It's pretty straightforward. We've heard that from so many guests on the podcast. Observe, right? So that's number 2.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and that's something that I try and hopefully preach on the show as much as I can, is just sit and wait for a minute. Before we started the show, I was telling you about a fishing trip I had last week on that little bit of private water out here. And I found like the only public section going through a giant ranch. So it was nice. But I sat there and the fish there were a couple of one-off risers, so nothing consistent enough to make me think that, I need to throw a dry on.
Yeah.
But I remarked Alex was with me, and you could watch the fish flash. You could see their sides flash as they moved to eat nymphs in the water.
Nice. That's cool.
And you don't always get to see that, right?
Yeah.
So I pointed that out to Alex, like, dude, look, you can see them flashing. And it was so fun, because that told us exactly where in the water column the fish were.
Yeah.
Because normally you're like, all right, I'm going to set up my nymph rig, and normally you want to drop that nymph rig down fairly deep, right?
Yeah.
But they were suspended. They were about midway through the water column.
Oh, wow.
Snacking on fish.
Yeah.
Or snacking on nymphs, I mean. So that eliminated a ton of guesswork for us right off the bat, because we didn't just start casting right out of the gate.
Wow.
So
yeah, that's it.
I love it.
So that one's pretty straightforward. Yeah, I mean, obviously it applies to trout fishing, but it probably applies to everything, I'd imagine. I haven't done a ton of saltwater fishing, but I'm guessing that being observant out there is part of the game too, right?
Yeah. I would hope so. I haven't done a whole lot of saltwater fishing myself either.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, observation, it is key. I mean, there's so many times when I've forced myself to just sit and wait and watch, and I've been successful because that's happened. And it's shocking sometimes how easy is the wrong word, but almost simple it feels when you do sit to watch, especially like during a dry fly hatch, and you watch and you really pay attention to the rises, especially if you're not as up on your rise forms as maybe you could be. If you really pay attention and you watch not just the rise forms, but you watch which bugs are getting eaten. I was in Montana for a little bit of last week, and there was a blue wing hatch going on, and I threw a blue wing on, and I didn't catch a single fish. But Alex caught 3, and he was nymphing, and he caught them all on midges, because there were also midges hatching, but I just ignored the midges and tied a blue wing on.
Yeah.
So it was, if I'd just been patient and observed a little bit, I would have seen that the midges were the bugs that were getting eaten off the surface, but I didn't. I just saw blue wing. It's like, oh, blue wing time, and got into it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. That's good.
Tip number 3. What do we got?
Yeah. Tip number 3. So this is a big one, and this is probably one that always gets people when they're thinking about fly fishing is the cast, right? So practice casting. Again, these are all fairly straightforward, but practice casting, and this isn't necessarily practice casting while on the river. The idea being is that practice casting before, you get on the river, or, you can go in your yard. If you're brand new to it, tie in a little piece of yarn, get in your yard, use the grass, and practice casting in the front yard. You could do that before you even get on the water. You can also practice getting on the water and practice casting there. But, the thing where you're thinking like, I'm going to practice casting and I'm going to try to catch fish, that's where it gets a little tough, right? And so I've heard that over and over from guests. And we've had, I just interviewed somebody from the Golden Gate Casting Club, right? And they told the history of this casting. If you haven't heard that, this is really interesting because some of the greatest casters in the game went through this place. Tim Rajeff, Steve Rajeff, all sorts of old timers, Powell back in the day. All this innovation came through. And that literally, if you've been to that casting club, they have some of these around the country, it's just ponds. You're just practice casting. And if you ask any of those people who are the best in the world, guarantee you they're casting probably as much as they're fishing. And that's kind of thing, because that goes against my thing too, because I always think of myself as a better fisherman than a better caster, and that sort of thing. But I think that 100% take time and focus on the cast. That's huge, and like I said, I practiced casting with the spade rod. I did that. That was 30 days in a row of casting. But again, we could always be getting better at your cast. So that's the third one. And that's one I've heard as much as the first two we talked about.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense, because if you can't put the fly where it needs to be, you're not going to catch fish, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite casting drill that you like to use that has helped you?
Yeah. I mean, man, the drills I do, and again, I've been as much susceptible of falling into the trap as anybody, right?
Yeah.
But I think probably the biggest one is for me, again, I kind of go back to spay a little bit, but you can apply this to your single hand casting as well, is look at your D loop, look at your cast. It's okay to look back behind you and see what's going on, because that will tell you, especially with the D loop and your cast, you can tell what's going on. So that's probably one thing I try to do when I'm practicing. But to be honest with you, I do tend to fall on that thing. I want to get out there and fish, and having fished, and fished at least single hand my whole life, I feel like I'm a decent caster. But again, it just shows you my ability. I still have a lot to learn.
Yeah.
I mean, there's times with the wind, and there's times when the situations are tough where my cast doesn't always go out like I want it to. So I have lots of room to learn as well. But I think just, again, observing, like we said, observing and watching your cast and seeing what it's doing, because that tells you a lot about what's happening. Tim Rajeff was on the podcast, and he said, we talked about this thing when you go back and you cast and you hear that snap.
Yep.
And he said, do you know what that is? And I was like, well, yeah, that's when you go too fast and you snap off your fly typically. And he's like, no, he's like, yeah, but that's also your line. He said basically breaking the sound barrier is what he said. Something like that. We'll have to look at the episode, but it was something really, because obviously Tim's really nerdy with the engineering stuff, but and he made that clear too. It's look at the cast, see what you're doing, practice, all this comes with it. And, practice. That's kind of what it is.
Yeah. Well, you're never going to regret the time you spent practicing. I'll tell you that right now. One thing that I found helpful for beginners with casting is explaining what was the most difficult part of learning it for me. And for me, I think the most difficult part of learning the cast was getting the timing down, more than anything else. But what about you? What was there a specific part of casting that was just really tricky, or maybe even a specific cast?
Yeah. For single hand, I mean, for me, again, the short stuff is kind of cool because it's all about the stroke. The stroke thing is something that, again, you can learn. You start, if you're casting short, 20 feet, 30 feet, you don't need a very long stroke, right?
Yeah.
If you're casting further, that's where you've got to change your stroke a little bit. And for me, I grew up, like I said, steelhead fishing, and on like for summer steelhead. So we were trying to make long casts. And I don't know how long we were making, but when you get out there and you're trying to make a 70 foot, 60, 70, 80 foot cast or something like that, and then there's wind, that gets pretty challenging to do. So I think I really struggled getting out, and the haul was something I really struggled with early on, getting that, because I felt like, you kind of have to have that haul. And so, Joan Wolf, we had her on in episode 100, and she talked about the timing on the haul. Like, you do it right, at the end. So those are those little tips that you hear about, and then you get out and practice it. You hear from these people, and then you work on it. But I think the long cast in the haul was something that I still am kind of working on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that's something I should. And again, I have this funny story I've talked about. I think it's an upcoming solo episode I'm doing. but I went to this FFI certificate. Well, it wasn't even a certification. It was like day one of you want to get started FFI certs. I went there and it was pretty embarrassing because I had a dirty old fly line that wasn't performing very well, right? So, and I went there and I started casting it. It was clear what the instructor came over. He gave me his rod. I was struggling with my rod. He gave me his rod. I was casting great.
Yeah.
So this goes back to gear again. Back to the gear thing too. Observing, it all goes back to that, like taking care of your stuff. But to answer your question, I mean, I still have tons of struggles.
Yeah.
I would love to say I'm amazing. I'm casting. I mean, what do they cast in these competitions up to like 260 feet or something like that?
Oh yeah, it's insane.
I'm not even.
Yeah.
I will never. I mean, I'm still just a normal caster. I cast good enough to catch a trout. You know what I mean? And that's kind of where I am.
But that's right where I am too.
Yeah.
I have found though about the haul. I've found that I use the haul, either a double or a single haul, almost all the time now that I've figured it out. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, pretty much is. Yeah, I feel like you don't have to use it, but there's a lot of times where it just helps. Yeah, whether you have wind or whatever. But I do. I feel like for sure on the single, but yeah, I tend to do the same as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, what is tip number 4? We're cruising through these, man.
Yeah. I mean, let's get through this. So this one is, I mean, and this is kind of a more of a, again, general tip, but smaller is better. And this is interesting because you've got some of these things. You see giant flies for steelhead. You can catch fish on giant flies. All the streamer stuff, right? You got all that going. But I've heard quite a bit from people, and that smaller is better. A lot of times, like you're out there, you're seeing this hatch again. You're on the water. You see something. If you find that bug, go a size smaller than you think you need, right? And that's something I've heard. So Rick Hafley is an entomologist out west. He's been on the podcast a couple of times. This is something that he mentioned a number of times that, and he's spent his career in entomology, basically understanding bugs. And he says that's a problem a lot of people have, is just using too large of flies. And that goes to fly tying as well, right? So in fly tying, especially if you're a beginner, you just put too much stuff on. So whatever you do in fly tying, it's kind of like use half as much as you think you need, especially if you're getting started. And so smaller is better in that too. And I feel that, again, it's pretty straightforward, but you're probably going to have better success if you go a little bit smaller. And, we had Ed Angle on a while back, and he talked about fishing really the tiny flies.
Yeah. Ed's the master of the small fly stuff, man. He knows his stuff. For those who don't know, Ed Angle, retired Forest Service, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Forest Service, written a whole bunch of books about fishing tiny flies, and the guy's just brilliant at it. So he knows his stuff. So if you ever have more questions about fishing small flies, listen to the episode that Dave did with Ed, and then read Ed's books, because
exactly.
I mean, they're dense. That's not bedtime reading, right? That's stuff that you study.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh
yeah, he's good, and AK Best as well. I think there's a few guys out there that are doing some good stuff, So and again, it's hard because you go, especially if you're new. Again, going back to new, do I want to put on a size 22, 24, whatever? I mean, that's some tiny stuff, and you don't always have to, and that's not the point here. The point is that maybe as you're trying stuff, maybe try a little bit smaller. That's the thought here.
Yeah, I like that thought, and I agree. I was watching something the other day. I think it was with Tom Rosenbauer over at Orvis, and he mentioned always go down a size smaller than what you think, because we have a tendency to size up especially when we're matching dry flies.
Yeah.
We see them buzzing in the air.
Yeah.
But then today I was actually reading through an older article in Fly Fisherman magazine about drake hatches, and talking about when there's a lot of drakes on the water, and drakes are really big mayflies. For those who don't know, they're the really big mayflies, they're king of them. And the author of that piece, and I don't remember who it is, but they said to size up like 1 to 2 sizes. So if there's size 12s on the water, fish an 8 to stand out in those really big hatches. What do you think about that piece of advice? Because I've heard the stay small all the time.
Yeah.
But I really like to pick people's brains about, well, what if we unmatch the hatch just in size? What happens
Yeah.
then?
Yeah, I mean, I think like everything in fly fishing, there's never one size fits all. I think it's part of, and never one situation that fits every, right? So there's always going to be hatches and bugs and situations and weather conditions and water temps that are going to affect it. So I think, yeah, the going small is more of a generalization, but I for sure think that there's situations, like I said, there's where a larger fly is going to work. And we know for sure, look at some of these things they're using for streamers,
Yeah.
out there, right? Some of this stuff is, and even back, so I think it obviously works. Um, and I'm sure there's other hatches. When I was talking to Rick, I know he definitely wasn't talking about the Drake hatch. He was
Yeah.
talking more generally about, you're grabbing a little bug on the water. We, like you said, like Tom said, you tend to think it's a little bigger than it actually is,
Yeah.
right? But I agree. I think, yeah, the Drake hatch, 100%. And again, it's experimenting. If you
Yep.
try something smaller and it's not working, well, you got to keep trying stuff. You got to try
Yeah.
different colors, different sizes. I mean, that's part of what's great about fly fishing.
It is. And I think sometimes beginners get a little hesitant to color outside the lines. And you should never be that way, because there really aren't hard and fast rules in fly fishing. There's a bunch of guidelines, right?
Yeah.
We tell you, well, this is the end result you're aiming for. You want a natural looking drift with a bug that is a passable imitation of what the fish are eating. That's your goal at the end of the day. How you get there and what a passable imitation is, that's going to change. And you need to color outside the line sometimes to really dig into that and just discover what will work and what won't work. So, yeah, that's something I'd remind people about. And the only other time I've heard like the size up is my friends who fish on the tailwaters, who guide on the tailwaters, where there's those blanket mayfly hatches early in the season when there's so many, it looks like giant rafts of carpet floating down the river. They're like, yeah, go a size up in that instance, because there's so many,
there's so much
on the water that you've got to make your fly stand out a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. Or use the purple haze. I give Alex a hard time.
The purple haze. Yeah.
Yeah. I give Alex a hard time all the time about the purple haze, because he loves it. And I think it's sacrilege, because an Adams is an Adams gray color, and I will die on that.
That's right. That's right. I know the purple and all that stuff is pretty interesting, because it definitely works. But yeah, will it eventually? Will it always work? Will it always work as good? Will there be some other color or some other thing that comes out that we don't know of yet that's going to work better?
Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably, because it's always changed. There's always something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Tip number 5. What do we got?
So tip number 5 is one that I've used for pretty much everything, but I think it really applies to fly fishing, is the KISS method. The keep it simple, stupid, right? Keep it simple, stupid is basically, don't overthink it. Again, you can talk about all this stuff. We can go into entomology. We can go into all these topics. You can go as far as you want, as deep as you want to go. But when you're just starting out, it's very important to realize keeping it simple is the most important thing. Get a rod, get a reel, get a line, get a fly, get a leader, get on the water, and start doing it. And don't feel like everything has to be perfect, and you have to have every single thing in fly fishing, right? You don't have to buy waders right up front. You don't have to get all this stuff. You can literally borrow a rod if you wanted to, right? You could. So I think that people feel like, and the casting is another thing, right? When you see somebody casting, you feel like right away, wow, that's so hard. That's so hard to do. But again, I think there's some simple, basic things somebody could show you how to do to get started. And it's just keep it simple. I think when we get started, we tend to do that. We just feel like it's too much. Once you get going and you learn, then you can start building on, just like anything, right? Learn more more casts, do more things, get into fly tying, learn entomology, learn all the scientific names of every single bug if you want to. So all that stuff. So I think that keeping it simple is probably one of the most important things you can do when you get started.
I agree. One follow-up for you there. You grew up in a fly shop. Your dad was he a guide, or was he just a fly shop run?
Oh, yeah, he was a guide.
Okay, guide, fly shop owner. So your dad's all in. He's both feet into this, right?
Yeah.
And you grew up surrounded by that. I grew up in a family of fly tyers, and I didn't even know nymphs were a thing until high school because my grandpa and my dad only tied and sold dry flies or
Oh,
streamers.
nice. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
so I didn't even know you could catch a fish on a nymph
Right.
until well into my teens.
That is
Uh,
awesome.
but for guys like us, we grew up around it. We're surrounded by this,
Yeah.
and it really is. You sort of soak it up. You end up becoming like a sponge. It becomes less something we do and more part of our life, right?
Yeah.
But for
Yeah.
people who are coming into it completely, like maybe they've thrown a worm on a hook before and that's it.
Yeah.
But is it really as simple as you and I are saying it is? Because our perspectives might be a little bit skewed.
Yeah.
What would you say to that person who's like, well, this is the most outdoorsy thing I've ever done, or I've never even fished before, but I want to try fly fishing? Is it really as simple as we've said it is in this whole episode?
Right. 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 I mean, in all honesty, I mean, it's not as simple as taking a spin rod with a worm and throwing it out there with it, or with a bobber or something like that. It's, it's not that simple but although even that, it takes some, you got to be able to figure out a spin rod. I mean, the cast is part of the thing, right? I mean, the cast is it is the thing. So you have to learn to cast the fly rod, number one, and then you got to catch fish. You got to catch fish. You put on a fly, you go into a fly shop, whatever, somebody says, this is the fly that worked yesterday. You go out there on the water, you got to find that fish. You got to avoid spooking it. You got to land. So, I mean, it's not easy, right? I won't say this is not an easy thing to do, but that's again, why I think we all love fly fishing.
Yeah.
Because if it was easy, I don't think we'd love it as much. We'd probably be fishing with worms.
Yeah. It's a very rewarding challenge, but it's also a very surmountable challenge.
Yeah.
It's not, you're definitely going to feel as a beginner, you're definitely going to feel like you're banging your head against a wall at times. Yeah. That's normal, but it is surmountable, I think.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And what is, think of the things that are harder than fly fishing, right? Like what is some stuff out there that's harder than fly fishing?
Knife making. I'll tell you, I've tried that, and that's way
knife
harder.
Making. Yeah. What about shooting a 3-pointer in basketball?
Yeah, probably is.
I mean, I've shot lots of 3-pointers in my life, but again, something I started since a little kid. But yeah, I think if you just picked up basketball and tried to, I always think about that when I'm out there shooting with my kids. I'm like, man, I just hit a 18-footer. That is like kind of crazy that I could even make that.
Yeah.
Right. But that's hours. What do they say? It takes 10,000 hours to become an expert in anything. Right. That's the 10,000 hours of, same with fly fishing, right? You do it enough time, you're going to eventually become an expert.
Yep. Eventually you'll get there, and don't be discouraged by the maybe slow start, right? Because that's 100% normal to have that happen.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think you've got a little bonus tip for us, Dave.
Yeah, I got two quick ones. So so one bonus, and this is back to the observe. I think something, again, all these I've struggled with. This is the cool thing, right? I think I've struggled with all these in my life, but the journaling. I think journaling is a really good thing to think about, especially on the observing part of all this, because knowing and remembering what you do out there is key. So if you're on the water, just taking some basic notes, having a journal and having it either out with you or in the car, and just making notes like, okay, here was the temperature of the water. Here's what went on. I use these sizes because, that stuff's going to come back and be helpful for you down the line. When you come back the next year to that same spot, you could look at your journal and be like, oh, okay, this is what I did. It gives me a good starting point. So I think journaling is one little bonus tip to throw in there. The other one is connecting, and this is kind of a conservation. We always have a conservation focus around, a lot of our podcasts, but connect with your local. That's one of the
many reasons sorry to interrupt. That's one of the many reasons I enjoy your show as much as I do, because the conservation bents that you get into it is great, and it's the stuff that folks need to be aware of and to think about.
Yeah, exactly. And so we've been, I always highlight, I love the Patagonia, because they're one of the great conservation champions out there, and they're doing some great stuff. And I had Yvon Chouinard on the podcast, and I talked to him about some of this stuff and asked him these same questions, like, what can we do? And his answer was a good one. He was like, I can't tell you what you should do for conservation. Everybody's got to choose their own thing. But what he did say, and is what Patagonia does, is supports local groups. So my bonus tip is go find a local group in your area. You likely have some group, whether it's Trout Unlimited, some watershed council. There is some group in your area. Find that group and connect with them. And the cool like double bonus is that not only will you be helping conservation, helping protect the fish we're all fishing for, but you will likely be connecting with people that are already anglers, and that might be your person that can help you. Instead of getting a guide, maybe you can go fishing with that person. Some of those, you know what I mean? So again, it's all this thing that in order to have a more success on the water, you can't do it alone. I totally agree. I mean, you could do it, but you're going to have way more enjoyment if you do this with some people.
Yeah. And I mean, with that, man, I think that wraps us up. But where can folks find you if they want more of your content? Where do you want folks to go?
Yeah, I think if folks right now, if you go out to, Wet Fly Swing everywhere on social, online, but if you go to wetflyswing.com/untangled, I put together a little summary of a short little solo episode I did where I talk about kind of a little more here. And we're going to be adding some stuff to that page as we go. I'm going to be creating more of some other, helpful tips and we'll have links to the episodes we talked about today as well. Some of the good episodes just for people who are new to it. But yeah, you can go there right now. And if you want to grab the PDF I have, that's there. But yeah, listen to that episode and subscribe to the podcast. That's my biggest thing. Go if you're on Apple or wherever, just subscribe, follow us. And we do a lot of content. So I guarantee you, if you listen, you're going to hear something. And the other thing I throw out to people is if anybody wants a podcast episode, we do so much, I will put one together for you if they reach out to me. I'll put together I'll put together a topic and an episode. So I always throw that out. I do that all the time with my listeners as well. Like, hey, I'm here. Let me know, man. I want to do this for you. So that's out there as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Awesome. Well, Dave, I appreciate your time and appreciate you taking the time to do this. Putting together a page on your site for listeners of Untangled. I know they're going to appreciate that a ton as well. So thank you so much for your time today and everything else that you've done.